Hello and welcome to Health Talk. I'm your host, Angela Baracco Eddy, and with me tonight is Dr. Roger Orth. He is a board-certified gastroenterologist with the Sacred Heart Division of Gastroenterology Associates. You can find him at Sacred Heart as well as the Endoscopy Center on Davis Highway. We are live this evening. Eventually, we will be taking your calls, but we're going to start the first half of tonight's program with a little bit of a history lesson and a little bit of a conversation to give you some background before we do open the lines, because it's going to be an interesting topic tonight. Tonight, we are going to be talking about opioid wars, and I know that some of you probably have some questions about that, some comments that you'd like to share. But again, we're going to start off with a little bit of background on that, and it's going to be quite an interesting program. We encourage you to keep watching, and I guarantee that you will learn some things that you did not know before you started watching this evening. So Dr. Orth, as always, it is great to see you.
Angela, thanks for taking time away from your new baby.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank
you. Yes, and it's an interesting topic tonight, so I'm going to kind of let you introduce it and give us some history, and we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah, I thought it would be interesting for me to reflect a few issues that pop up. And it turns out, many of you would know, or some of you would know, that I happen to have the recent privilege of going to my daughter's wedding. My daughter got married to Surya Kapoor. And at the time of going to the wedding, I had to prepare the fact that the wedding was being held in New Delhi. Well, guess what? I don't know zip about New Delhi nor Old Delhi, but I can tell you about it today. But I'm going to talk a little bit about something that comes to mind, because this is also, as now the oldest of the gastroenterologists at Sacred Heart, I have a bit of a perspective of history, and a history of having seen my practice change and the practice of the other doctors, and most importantly, the practice of watching people. People have changed in this country and in Pensacola. My patient population, their drug list has changed. And you'll hear me rant about this or that, that has to do with the healthcare reform law or something. But I thought that tonight I would deal with an issue that I think is actually very pertinent, which has to do with people who have narcotic-related problems. Problems, and you say, well, that doesn't affect me. It affects every single one of us. And it also has something to do with my trip to India. Because in the talk about it, I want to talk a bit about how people don't really realize how intermixed corporations can be in coming to the point where they're controlling our lives and we don't know what's going on. So actually I thought I'd talk not just about current day problems with narcotics and the side effects I see in the GI tract and how often I see this, where I used to never see this. Mm-hmm. Back in the 80s when we did this, we almost never saw this type of problem. And the main thing we knew about heroin in med school, they brought in a couple of guys who were shooters, and we learned a bit about it, and we found out it was an expensive habit, and it really didn't affect us, except we took care of their endocarditis, we took care of their skin pop and their problems with infections and their kidney failure and their immune complex diseases, and it was all very interesting, but it didn't affect my everyday life. Now I'm seeing so many narcotic-related problems, and yet how is this going to relate to India? India. It's because I happened to read a book on India. Actually, I read about 10 or 15 books. This one I thought was particularly cogent, which is the history of the East India Company. Mm-hmm. And the East India Company turns out to be the first international corporation. And in the process, I'm also going to link it back to some of our current companies that are seemingly not really exposed to the consequences of what's happened, but people are very proud of them. And I'm particularly noting that I can do this entire thing from just reading headlines and articles in the Wall Street Journal, because I happened to also notice just 2 or 3 weeks ago that one particular family that owns the Purdue pharmaceutical company that makes not many products but they make narcotics. And that company is wholly owned by a couple of doctors, and their family has now become the 13th richest family in the United States. And they have done such wonderful things, donating this and that. But what about the drugs they sell? What about that? And how does that come back to the East India Company? So to go to India, I had to understand a bit about it. Now, I knew I was going to have to go to the tailor. I actually wore a turban in this, and I wore a sherani. It was very nice. And by the way, this shirt
I wish we had pictures.
Yeah, I could show them. But in any event, I actually have this shirt on tonight. It was made by the tailor who made my sherani, which is a long outfit. And it was really very regal, quite spectacular. But in the process of reading about the commerce of New Delhi, which happens to have 21 million people in it, and then, by the way, it's very crowded. Very nice, but crowded. I also read a little bit about the economics of how it all evolved. Because when you read today and you see that we're having issues associated with the narcotics, it's also linked to the foundation of what's going on in Europe right today, which has to do with Brexit and the London exchanges. And what made the London exchanges? Well, what made the London exchanges was the East India Company. The East India Company starts in the early, let's say, 1600s. And at the time, England there's not much to England. It's not a very big gross domestic product. They don't have a lot of unusual culture outside their episphere, which would be European. And by any stretch of the imagination, they were nowhere near the Mughals who were running the show over in India. And that was a very moderate group of Muslims. And they were certainly not with the lineage and the background of the Queen Dynasty, which is Q-I-N-G, because all those guys are gone now. Where did they go? The nice guys from India and the nice guys from China. The East India Company got rid of them. And they got rid of them because of narcotics. They got rid of them because of a power structure. And so let's go over for just a few moments the East India Company. I realize this is not that digestive, but it turns out that it is.
It gets there eventually.
It gets there, and you may have to replay this whole thing. This will play several times this month. But the East India Company starts out, and it turns out they're very successful because they've penetrated what is, in fact, a really heterogeneous place called India. And there's multiple little maharajas and people who have their kingdoms. And guess what? The richest people in the world are there. And so they end up finding these things that those India people have, and then they take them home, and it actually increased the economy. And England got more money, and they actually ended up getting more successful, and they pushed the Dutch out of India, and they pushed the French out of India, and then they pushed the Portuguese out of India. And then along comes Napoleon. And Napoleon, he has big plans. He's going to make this trip to India. He's got this whole thing worked out with Alexander and the Russians, and they got all these Prussians coming in, and Russians coming in, and they've got the different warriors, and he's going to start off with Egypt, and then, Nelson sinks his ships. Now he's going to have a hard time getting over to India. But he's still got a land route across Iran. He's going to do this whole deal. But in the end of the day, what happens in India and what happens in China is directly a result of the dissolution of Napoleon. When Napoleon lost his ability to become a force, the British Empire was no longer restrained. They were no longer restrained, and we ended up with a situation where they went from being very chummy with the ruling leaders to deciding they're going to take it, that this was going to become theirs and they would run it. And so India at the time has like 60, 65 different parts of it. And there's this event called Plessy. And one thing in the event of Plessy, they have this battle. And for the first time, they actually got ownership of a section, which happens to be Bengal. Well, that's interesting. Now they've got Bengal. And so they're encroaching on things. And the East India Company, being the large company it is, they actually were market makers. They made the London markets. They made the markets that ended up being importing. And so what was it they had a monopoly on? They had a monopoly on everything they traded in. That was how it worked. And when they had this monopoly, they traded in things called tea. So we all remember the American Revolution, right? And it had something to do with a tea party in Boston and this and that. Well, that's the tea taxes, and those taxes had to do with the English government, but the tea was being carried by the East India Company. Mm-hmm. And they had to pay for that tea somehow. And so they'd run out of things to sell. They ran out of things to sell over there to buy the tea. So they had to come up with things that they could sell. And what could they sell? Well, the tea came from China. Remember, all the tea is in China, that type of thing? And so they were selling, and the Chinese, they had this deal going that they wanted sterling. They liked silver. And so they had tried out the woolens. Woolens. Who needs a woolen in India, much less in China? They didn't like that kind of cloth, the feel, because they had silks. And remember the Silk Road? This whole thing evolves out of the Silk Road initially. But ultimately, tea became such an addiction after the 1700s that the English were having a problem with the balance of trade. Well, the good news is that with the dissolution of Napoleon, we end up with this whole situation where they're in charge of one section, and this section of Bengal has this little area called Bihari, and guess what they make? They make poppies, opium.
Grow flowers.
So they make these pretty poppies. Some are red, some are lavender. They're mostly red and pinks and things. And what's in a poppy? A poppy is a complex compound that's produced that's an alkaloid. And alkaloids are a very interesting structural group. Most of them have 4 rings to it. But in reality, they become morphine. And if you modify it, it becomes heroin. Or if you modify it, you can make other things, such as OxyContin, such as drugs that you've heard of now. But at the time, it was pretty obvious that we needed something to sell over there, and the Chinese didn't want anything that we had. So what did they do? They ended up having the peonage system, which was that you would have to work for a living, and as you worked for a living, you had to grow something, but they stopped making as much cotton because the Chinese no longer needed the cotton. They make silk anyway. So what could you grow? Poppies. Poppies. So they grew a lot of poppies. And they started shipping them. But now the Chinese, they don't like to have the poppies because the Qing dynasty, they don't like this. So you could only bring it out to like Canton, and you could go to the river. And when you went to the river, you would have to sell it on a particular island. You have to stay on this particular island. But narcotics in Europe were actually pretty common. People had been getting poppies from Turkey. People got poppies from what is in fact Pakistan, Afghanistan, which was, by the way, still part of India at the time. And they would make laudanum. Laudanum was a nice old-time type of a device that you could take, and it would make you feel good, and you get kind of groggy, help you sleep, that type of thing. They might even put it in things like tea. And so you have this laudanum deal, but the Chinese, they did not have the laudanum approach. They would take the poppies, and they had a different delivery system. And similar to the delivery system that we see today, it's best to have a very good mucous membrane or an intravenous or an intranasal approach because you can get a much quicker rush. Because when you have a poppy, you have an alkaloid, and the alkaloid is going to deal with a specific set of receptors. And those are the receptors that you hear about when you hear people go jogging and get high over it, or they work out. Those are the enkephalins and the endorphins. It makes you feel good. And it's the pleasure centers, frankly. And so those enkephalins, it turns out the poppies do the same part. They stimulate that. And they stimulate certain receptors in it. But the Chinese, they had found a different delivery system. They smoked it. So as they smoked it, it's a very big rush, but you would get addicted to it.
And that was the beginning of the opium dens.
That led to the opium dens.
And with that, we're going to take our first break. We have a lot more to talk about when we come back, and we will be right back in just 1 minute with more health talk.
Your word is gastroenterologist.
Can I have the definition?
A physician who specializes in diseases of the digestive tract.
Can you please use that in a sentence?
When stomach pain persists, you should see a gastroenterologist.
Could you tell me where I could find one?
The Endoscopy Center on North Davis Highway has a highly trained staff of 12 gastroenterologists who are ready to serve all of your gastrointestinal needs.
G-A-S.
Your first date. Your first job interview. Your wedding day. Your first baby. The firsts of everything can be scary, but you survive. Your first endoscopy may increase your chances to survive. Colon cancer screenings can save your life. If you won't do it for yourself, do it for the ones who love you.
The Endoscopy Center of Pensacola is an ambulatory care center designed with the patient in mind. Conveniently located on North Davis Highway, the center specializes in outpatient endoscopy. This is the direct visualization of the digestive tract with a video camera. Several different types of procedures are performed involving the esophagus, stomach, small intestines, rectum, and colon. All procedures are performed by board-certified gastroenterologists. Ask your doctor about the Endoscopy Center or call 474-8988.
Hello and welcome back to Health Talk. I'm your host, Angela Eddy, and with me tonight is Dr. Roger Orth. He is a board-certified gastroenterologist with the Sacred Heart Division of Gastroenterology Associates. Tonight we are talking about opioid wars, from the East India Company to the GI tract. And before the break, we had kind of left off on our history lesson when we were just getting to opium dens and the effect that they were starting to have on the civilized world, I guess. So, Dr. Orth, again, this is going to be it is a live show tonight, but we will start taking calls later in the program. We want to kind of continue with the history lesson for a little bit before we get to the modern day implications of this and of these opioids, of these narcotics on the GI tract specifically, and the things that Dr. Orth is dealing with almost on a daily basis now here in his practice in Pensacola. So we will open the phones a little bit later on, but we're going to get back to a little bit of history, and we'll pick up, Dr. Orth, with opium dens.
Right. So we get into taking over parts of India. Now we have to make our balance of trade. We have the company that the corporation that changed America, or the world, and that's the East India Company. And they set up a board of trade, and they have to do the trading back and forth. And they have to pay for their tea, and they're running behind on making tea payments because they had run out of things to take away from the Maharajas. They'd already gotten the Queen's jewels, all the diamonds, the biggest diamond mines in the world were in India. And they'd taken them home already, so they ran out of things that they could do. So now we've got a product we could sell, because there are a lot of Chinese people at the time, then and now. And so the Chinese had a tradition of smoking their opium, because if you're going to get a hit, you're going to really get a bigger rush if you can smoke it or shoot it. Now, they hadn't invented the hypodermic needle, so of course smoking it made good sense, especially those who wanted to get stoned. But you have to actually get to the point where you can do it. So opium became a major commerce, which was sanctioned by the British government, but in reality was the East India Company. And part of my talk here is that no one knew at home this is what's going on. At home, they were getting wealthier, they had nice events, they had parties, they had nicer houses, and the people who came back from India would buy these big houses, and they'd buy these big places to stay. But the people didn't realize under what circumstance this money was showing up. But it was a business. They had to find something to business. And the business of shipping tea, it turned out they really liked a lot of tea. And if you took the tea taxes and ultimately you took the opium money It turned out that's about a third of all the money that came into England in the early 1800s.
Wow.
That's a third of it. And so opium is a sanctioned item. And I tell you this because what goes around comes around. We're living in it today. Because the narcs today are coming out of China also. Special narcs, which we're going to get to at the end of the show. And so what's gone around is coming around because they had to pay for it. They actually had ratio, and if you look at the number of, they would sell it in boxes. They had branded this like you would brand a Marlboro cigarette or Tide. And it was a special kind of opium that came from a very good place, and they made it for the consumer of India. And they would have it in chests. It would be branded with a special symbol. And they even played off, when they didn't control all the production, they would get the stuff out of Goa. And that was a type of opium called malwa, which is a lower quality brown opium. It wasn't as good. We couldn't smoke as much, probably left you with a cough or something. But in any event, they ended up doing this trade, and the trade would go ultimately, as you look at the amount of tea that was purchased to the amount of opium that was purchased and the amount of sterling, the Chinese ended up having less and less sterling going into their country because they were not selling that, because what in fact they were trading for is opium. And they actually, more than one generation of people became hooked on this. There were 10, 15, 20 million heavy consumers that were known, and the inner parts of China were not known, but they were being supplied. And you had 46 pounds of tea for every pound of opium sold in 1801, but by 1833 it's 10 pounds of tea for every 1 pound of opium. This is a lot of opium. Of course, they do like a lot of tea, and it's expensive. So now they start taking over this and that, and it turns out they need to increase their market share. Because there are a lot of people in China, and they're paying for cash money for this one, and that's how we pay for the tea. And so when they want to increase the market share, the Qing dynasty, that's an emperor over there at that time, he just thinks those English people are the lowest forms of people, just like the Mughals thought the English were pretty rough. Except some of them learned to speak it, and they got nice, and they did this and that. But ultimately, they took away the whole country, got rid of the Mughals, brought in what is in fact today's Taliban, brought in today's grouping of radical Islamists, which I'm not afraid to say that word because there is a group of radicals. And the earliest schools for that turned out to be a direct response to the cataclysm that occurred in the Muslim world in the northern India and Pakistan areas as a direct result of how they dealt with it. So in any event, they decide to expunge the control of the emperor over his own country, and they insisted that they should be allowed to import opium. Oh, you might remember this from like 11th grade or something. Opium Wars, what was that about? Well, it's about free trade. Well, actually they had a lot of people who would tell people in the British press that this is about freedom and free trade, and that, oh, by the way, so-and-so died while he was over there, but by the way, he was shipping in opium. But we're going to defend our country. And so eventually that leads to 1839 with the first set of wars, the first one. And guess what they get out of that one? Hong Kong. And they get out of, in addition, they had markets, but they still did not have legal approval from the group of people who were running China to sell it in it. So that led to the second and really third Opium War. And by the way, the United States is not completely off the hook here, because the East India Company was actually subbing it out to contractors who then were freelancers, and then they had to pay a fee for this. And a lot of Americans, once they ran out of whales, they ran out of whales to kill, and they no longer had any option to kill the whales, a lot of the shippers who went on to found some very famous schools in the East with the money that they made, they actually ended up shipping the opium. So they were part of the whole deal too. It's not. On the one hand, they were interested in stopping slavery, which the British did stop slavery earlier, but they enslaved lots of people in the peonage system. so that they could make the opium. But they had to make the market because they had to sell this stuff. So they ended up taking over big chunks of China. And they ended up forcing their way into it. And I will tell you, and it's my opinion, having been over to the Far East for my first time, that this is a group of people with a long memory. This is a group of people who will not forget this type of thing. And even the reference in a Wall Street Journal article, the most recent set, there's been 2 sets recently on the export of a different kind of narcotic, which is fentanyl, out of China, makes a reference to the wars of the Opium Wars, because these people have a long memory. And it's important to realize that who's running China, you just don't know. But there's people who are still angry to this day. And in fact, the people who ended up being, once they forced the Qing dynasty out of there, that led to such topsy-turvy times that ultimately that's how you got this very state-controlled process, the Communist Party. That's how it evolves. And you ended up having a whole group of radical Islamists who were forced over at the partition, had this whole issue, and that led to your Afghanistan deal. And, of course, that helped set up 9/11. Now, you had this entire process max out at the Sepoy Wars, because the Sepoy Wars in 1857 was stunning. How egregious it was, the way they handled the people and how they handled their traditions. In this case, it had to do something to do with the Enfield rifle, which had just come out. It was very important to us because it was our Civil War rifle. But, by the way, it's made out of beef tallow, and it had some pork tallow maybe. And so you have a bunch of Hindus who don't like one thing, which is the beef tallow. Remember, they don't eat beef. I learned that. I didn't eat any beef when I was in India. And you had a bunch of Muslims who did not like to have the pork part. And the next thing you know, all of their warriors who were keeping the population in control, there was such a small number, they were told that they had to bite the bullet. Bite the bullet. You've heard that? Bite the bullet?
That's right.
That led to the revolution, which in turn led to the actual expulsion once they actually got enough of the British troops together 2 years later. And that's what led to the final, well, the British government's going to take over and the corporation to change the world is out. But by the way, the effects of what they did is in. So I'm going to just trickle down a little bit then that narcotics took a different bent when the hypodermic needle gets invented. This is interesting because it is a different way of delivering it, and really Westerners didn't smoke dope that much. They smoked marijuana. That was a big cash crop, by the way, in Jamestown. It was the biggest cash crop in Jamestown for a while. Marijuana.
I didn't know that. We didn't learn that history.
As you go on to the drug delivery systems, you really have a sense that people like psychotropics. You like downers, uppers, and things that make you feel really good. And so there were some transitions, and you're going to have modern science applied to the narcotics. And modern science in the early 1900s brought us a compound that's called diacetyl morphine. So diacetyl morphine is just 2 acetate groups stuck onto morphine, and it has a common name called heroin. Wow. So that's a real euphoria maker, because that drug is filled with euphoria. It gets the whole limbic system. And the parts of the brain that it gets are very, not just downers or uppers, it's very peaceful, it's very sexual, it's very fed state, it's very enkephalinoid and endorphinoid. Wow, it's very intense. But to get it, you can't just swallow heroin, you have to shoot it. And so everyday people, they didn't shoot anything like that, because that's middle-class America didn't do that, and only the richest people and the very, very poorest people did things like that. Because you couldn't trust it for one, or you couldn't afford anything else for the other. So as recently as the 40s and 50s, let's say we have 150,000, 250,000 heroin addicts, but that's not that many to absorb into this population. Now today, we have 400,000+ heroin addicts. That's quite a few. And we have 2 million opioid addicts. People on opioids And those opioids are what we're going to go to next.
Absolutely. And it's time for us to take another quick break. We will be right back with more very interesting history and some more modern day explanation of the opioid wars when we come right back.
Your word is gastroenterologist,
Can I have the definition?
a physician who specializes in diseases of the digestive tract.
Can you please use that in a sentence?
When stomach pain persists, you should see a gastroenterologist.
Could you tell me where I could find one?
The Endoscopy Center on North Davis Highway has a highly trained staff of 12 gastroenterologists who are ready to serve all of your gastrointestinal needs.
G-A-S.
Your first date. Your first job interview. Your wedding day. Your first baby. The firsts of everything can be scary, but you survive. Your first endoscopy may increase your chances to survive. Colon cancer screenings can save your life. If you won't do it for yourself, do it for the ones who love you.
The Endoscopy Center of Pensacola is an ambulatory care center designed with the patient in mind. Conveniently located on North Davis Highway, the center specializes in outpatient endoscopy. This is the direct visualization of the digestive tract with a video camera. Several different types of procedures are performed involving the esophagus, stomach, small intestines, rectum, and colon. All procedures are performed by board-certified gastroenterologists. Ask your doctor about the Endoscopy Center or call 474-8988.
Hello and welcome back to Health Talk. I'm your host, Angela Eddy, and with me tonight is Dr. Roger Orth. He is a board-certified gastroenterologist with the Sacred Heart Division of Gastroenterology Associates, and you can find him at Sacred Heart as well as the Endoscopy Center on Davis Highway. Tonight's topic is a little bit different than what we typically do, but it's been very fascinating so far, and we're going to keep it right up there with the rest of the program tonight. The topic is Opioid Wars, from the East India Company to the GI Tract. We're getting closer to modern day. We've been kind of doing a little bit of a history lesson so far. We're going to continue with that just a little bit, but this is something that's very personal to Dr. Orth because he does see this on a regular basis in his daily practice now, and it's something that has history and roots going back hundreds of years, and it kind of all came to a head with his recent trip to India and some of the research he was doing to prepare for that trip. So we've been talking about the East India Company. We've been talking about China and the influences of the poppies and the opium that were being sold at that time, and kind of in relation to the tea that was being sold at the same time, and how that was kind of trickling through England, but also through America. America, at this point in our conversation, is almost 100 years old, and it's certainly making its presence known here as well. So, Dr. Orth, I'm going to kind of toss it back to you, and we'll pick up where we left off.
So I was leaving out, our approach to drugs in this country, because obviously we had this thing called like Coca-Cola that had cocaine in it, and people could buy using heroin actually because it was a good thing to prevent the addiction of morphine. And oh, by the way, we had incredible numbers of Civil War soldiers who were addicts to morphine. And so obviously we needed this more refined narcotics. So I'm leaving out the middle part of the gap story because obviously I need to jump to the current status. But I had just alluded that we have currently over 2 million opioid abusers, only 400-some thousand heroin shooters, and it turns out that this is costing this country over $100 billion a year probably in healthcare related costs. This is a lot of money. This is going to be enough, if we could straighten some of this out, that we would actually end up having less need for some Affordable Care Act that has more computer time than I can possibly stand to last in my practice. So how does this shake out then? What we have is we have something that teaches people, that gives people a sense of well-being, that people want to have it. And so we also have some people who become very smart about how to do things. So I'm just going to mention one particular family who's, I've already alluded that there they are, the 13th richest family in the United States. And guess what? That company starts by three brothers who are all psychiatrists. How cool is that? And so at psychiatry, they know how to feel good and how to do this and that. And one of them, he figures out that it'd probably be good if he stops being a psychiatrist who practices, because he's figured out how to do advertising, because he knows the inner yins and yangs. And he actually, this particular Sackler, becomes in the World Book or whatever it's called that they have. It's for the world's most famous advertisers. He's in this museum for them because he did the first $100 million advertising program that took one drug and made it to $100 million. And it was because of the marketing. And this was a drug called Valium. And so he brought it to fruition. The Valley of the Dolls, 1960s. All of you read the book. If you're too young, you should still read it. But at any rate, he didn't own that. Pfizer owned that corporation. But it turned out that he learned a lot from that process. And so they had gotten a little bit extra money, these guys. And so they bought this company, Purdue Frederick Pharmaceuticals. And what did they make? They made earwax, Cerumenex. They made laxatives. Ultimately, they made betadine. But that didn't turn out to be very lucrative. But one of the doctors, he was actually Mortimer. He was not able to get into med school in New York because of different conflicts. And so he ended up having to go to med school in Scotland. And that's a very good school. And they taught him a lot of things. And so once he started to make some money, he moved back to England because that's where a lot of people who think like this live, I guess. In any event, I'm thinking back to the East India Company, by the way. And so he goes back to England, and he's keeping his nose clean, selling earwax and such. But then he gets asked to please help because the English, remember I said that they had laudanum, oral morphine, but they wanted something for pain control in the poor people who were in the terminal house that had to do with cancer and such. And so the sisters came and asked him to make something. And he did. And they concocted this mixture. And it turned out that Knapp Pharmaceuticals had made this, and they made this compound, which I guess is called MS-Contin. MS-Contin. Well, those of us in medicine had always heard about that, but none of us ever used any MS-Contin because I never became an oncologist because I like patients who stay with me for a long, long time, although I do find a lot of cancers, and I do help people with the transition in life. I like to have continuity, and that's why I have 5 generations in some families. But with MS-Contin, you could deliver this pain and give good relief to the people who are suffering. And this was great. And so most of the MS-Contin type things were written for by oncologists because we all knew of compassion. But it became apparent that there were other ways that you could sell these kind of drugs, that you really could compound things. So other companies, this is not Purdue, they think of Percocet, they think of Vicodin, they think of things that have oxycodone in it. But most of those drugs that they think of have Tylenol in it, acetaminophen, or aspirin in it, some compound, so that if you were to shoot it, you would get sick as a dog. And so you end up with this situation where you have these pills, but you can't really abuse them that well. I mean, you could get hooked on them, but you're not going to shoot that kind of drug. We're not going to snort it because you don't really want to have liver failure or bleeding ulcers. So it became apparent that what we needed was a better delivery system, especially since the MS-Contin patent was about to run out. And they needed to have a product. So they repackaged an old compound, oxycodone, which is the same one that was in the Percocet type pills and things. But they repackaged it so that it's actually long-acting, or supposedly very long-acting. So they could change the dosing structure from Q6 hours to Q12 hours. And this is good because now they get the FDA to sign off on it, because it's also important to see who they know, who can help them get this going. And by the way, some of those people who have helped in the FDA, guess who they work for? Then they went to work for Purdue and some of the other kind of drug companies, but that one in particular. So they make this compound called OxyContin. And this is going to be a savior because you can actually help people long-lasting. You can end up having this long-lasting drug. It lasts a long time, and they can get away with putting it into, say, 10 milligram, 20 milligram, 40 milligram forms, but it's got this long-acting center section that you can't abuse, and so you have this slow release and a long release, and so there's a long-time pill. But it's a darn sight more oxycodone than we used to have. And there's two things that happen. One, it turns out that it is an addicting drug, just like Percocet would be or Vicodin would be. But it's such a big dose that you're actually working against yourself, because the way the narcs work is they're working on your mu receptors. They're stimulating this mu receptor. They release more of your own endogenous enkephalins and more endogenous endorphins. But guess what? There's this really nasty problem with narcotics of this type, because if you withdraw the drug, you have withdrawal, and it's uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Withdrawal is miserable. And if any of you have ever seen a person in withdrawal, you want to give them another hit, because it's just miserable. They have all kinds of diaphoretic things, nausea, GI symptoms, or you can go into seizures. So you have to realize that if you get people to a higher level, you have to maintain that level, and then you actually have to have even a higher level to get a high out of the high. But what was different about OxyContin was that you could actually do something that was not approved. They had high concentrations of the center section that would last longer, but if you broke it up with saliva, etc., then you could break it a different way, and then you can snort it, and now you got a straight shot. It was better than shooting. Actually, it was the same hit you get, but without an IV. And not that many people get, problems medically. Just cocaine actually screws the blood flow, so they would have holes in their nose and all kinds of weird stuff. This one just goes straight up, and it's right where it's going to work. It's right in your limbic system, right up into the brain. So you get these increasing doses. There's a tendency to be addicting. And so we have had a problem that evolved, and we have variability. And this is where we have federal laws on this, but we have some state penetration on it. And so some states end up with more OxyContin than other states. And how did this all shake out in the first place? Well, it turned out that our marketer, who was the best seller of Valium in the world, also was now owning this company. They're psychiatrists, by the way. And so they're able to figure out how this could sell. And what do? You go to the prescriber. And for the first time in history, a drug company would pull the files directly on who writes what drugs. I always think it's a bit egregious that somehow they know how much Nexium I write or Dexilent I write or whatever I write. But there's these little companies little geek squads that can figure out what I'm writing, and they tell the drug companies, and then the drug company will say, you're our biggest supplier, or you're our biggest such and such. And I'm kind of proud to be the biggest supplier at one time of Nexium or this or that. But honestly, I don't want to be in the list with the OxyContin, but they knew who was the OxyContin guys, and they also they put fronts that were actually the narcotics, that narcotics are good for pain of any source. Mm-hmm. And that changed the market. That went from Canton, which we can sell it just in Canton, we can just sell it on the fringe of China, to we're going to sell it inside China. And if you change the pain, what the threshold is to give the pain, if you have it for back pain, orthopedic pain, osteoarthritis, you have it for a host of things. Things that when I was in med school in the ancient days, when we were back in the time I was in there, no one would have ever thought of a narcotic for some of those things, because they're addicting, and by the way, it doesn't cure anything. And we knew that there was this thing of addiction. We knew that from the Civil War when the people had it. But all of a sudden, it becomes they are marketing it to it. They're marketing it that we should do it, and the primary care guys get involved. And on that note, we'll leave you with where we're going.
That's right. We'll be right back with more Health Talk.
Your word is gastroenterologist.
Can I have the definition?
A physician who specializes in diseases of the digestive tract.
Can you please use that in a sentence?
When stomach pain persists, you should see a gastroenterologist.
Could you tell me where I could find one?
The Endoscopy Center on North Davis Highway has a highly trained staff of 12 gastroenterologists who are ready to serve all of your gastrointestinal needs.
G-A-S.
Your first date. Your first job interview. Your wedding day. Your first baby. The firsts of everything can be scary, but you survive. Your first endoscopy may increase your chances to survive. Colon cancer screenings can save your life. If you won't do it for yourself, do it for the ones who love you.
The Endoscopy Center of Pensacola is an ambulatory care center designed with the patient in mind. Conveniently located on North Davis Highway, the center specializes in outpatient endoscopy. This is the direct visualization of the digestive tract with a video camera. Several different types of procedures are performed involving the esophagus, stomach, small intestines, rectum, and colon. All procedures are performed by board-certified gastroenterologists. Ask your doctor about the Endoscopy Center or call 474-8988.
Hello and welcome back to Health Talk. I'm your host, Angela Eddy. With me tonight is Dr. Roger Orth. He is a board-certified gastroenterologist with the Sacred Heart Division of Gastroenterology Associates. You can find him at the Endoscopy Center on Davis Highway as well as Sacred Heart Hospital, and he's at other places as well. Tonight's topic is different than what we normally discuss, but it's been fascinating. It's quite an interesting program. We've gone from the history to sort of the modern day. The topic tonight is opioid wars from the East India Company to the GI tract. And we've talked about the history of opioids really from the very first kind of real international trade with the East India Company through modern day. And we were just talking before the break about the addiction problem and some of the change in prescribing habits for some of those, especially OxyContin. And that's something that's certainly in the news. We hear about it all the time. There's big reports on it. There's big news regarding that. So kind of with that introduction, Dr. Orth, I'm going to pitch it right back to you because you've been
I'm not quite done yet.
Really going through.
I'm not quite done yet because, as it turns out, you can get addicted. So I have seen so many people show up with different things in just the last 10 and 15 years because OxyContin came out in 95, 96, and by 2000 it's $1 billion a year drug. Right now it's a $3.5 billion a year drug in this country. And so there's a couple of issues that I was going to mention because now you got it oral. If it's oral, it can be done easily. It can be transported easily. And I have met plenty enough patients who know exactly where these things are being sold because they are having pain. I said, well, where did you get the pill? I got it in Bay Minette because I know where they are selling it on Thursdays. This is now hitting small-town America. It's changing the character, and the dependency is changing the relationships and family dynamics. I have more grandparents taking care of children today than you can shake a stick at. It's just unbelievable how this has changed. And I remember one particularly beautiful girl out of Orange Beach, by the way, and she had had some breast surgery. She was very pretty. But at the end of the day, she was taking one of the Tylenol derivative oxycodones. She had maxed out at 32 a day. And so she had unlimited funds because she was beautiful. But they wanted to know if her liver was okay. And so when I'm telling you this is the real life experiences for me. And having just recently read up on the East India Company, I thought I would share some of those thoughts of how this has shaken out. Now, where is it going? Well, this is interesting because it never even crossed my mind that it's going to Tasmania. Where is Tasmania? Well, I just told my friend he should go to Tasmania. It's right near New Zealand. It's just off of this and that. And they have the Tasmanian devil, because I remember the cartoons. and I said, this would be cool. And I had seen an article in my New Scientist about traveling Tasmania, and you can canoe it or something. Well, guess what's a multi-billion-dollar a year industry in Tasmania? Making poppies. How did that happen? Well, Tasmania has a very nice homogeneous population. It's isolated. It's hidden away. It's on an island. It's hard to find, and most of us couldn't even tell you if you have an unnamed map where it is. But it turns out that they were looking, the Glaxo company was looking for a place to grow poppies. They tried England, by the way, and England, it's too wet there. And so they didn't grow it there. But they needed a place that had the right climate. They did the climate studies, and they found out that Tasmania could do it. Actually, they tried to get it into Australia, but Australia said, we don't want this. So they said, why don't you go to Tasmania, which is this unknown place that nobody had any economic anything there going on. And so they go to Tasmania. They find out it grows fine. They start growing poppies, and they make the poppies. They're selling it for prescription drugs that are needed for real patients. And this is because you need the precursor alkaloids to make these drugs. But then, miraculously, in the 1990 time frame, knowing that OxyContin's about to hit the door, knowing that the Percocets and the Percodans and the oxycodones have hit a big deal, they start doing something called Mendelian genetics. Do you remember Gregor Mendel? We've talked about him before. A good observer. But they do accelerated Mendelian. They get modification of the genome by different kinds of stressors onto plants. They're not actually gene splicing, but they're picking out just the right ones. And they came up with a rapid analysis so they could figure out which ones of them have thebaine. Well, now there's a word you've probably never heard. Thebaine is the precursor for oxycodone. They're now making plants that are pure thebaine. They don't make any morphine anymore. And they're making massive amounts of it. And so they're able to make it there. They control the market. And guess what? Johnson & Johnson, your baby powder people, they sell it also to Purdue and some of these other companies, and so as does Glaxo. Now, take heart, because the American way is there. We have higher technology. They're thinking of gene splicing it so that they can actually put Roundup in it. That way we can really incorporate and get it weed control for the poppies. And last but not least, I'm going to tell you what gets my unbelievable is that they went ahead and sequenced the genome for the poppy. This is interesting. Now, what do you do with a sequenced genome for a poppy? You figure out which ones of the genes are making the alkaloids. And they, at the University of California and Stanford has just recently announced that they actually have made it so they can make the entire glucose to codeine, glucose to narcotic in a yeast. We can mass produce this.
No flour.
So am I towards my end here?
You are
because
towards
I
your
am
end.
wanting to mention that this entire process, if you look at who these people are who are behind all of this, they're very wealthy, they're very famous, they're very nice, they give very nice presents to the country, art and this and that. But what got me going is when I saw that one of them was honoring Angela Davis at her museum, and I remember who Angela Davis is, and I'm not going to get into that other than to say now she's at a different level than she was when she was associated with the Black Panthers. But I can tell you, I can't believe who's really running this store. Not to mention that there's some very famous people that are being benefited by the money from these companies. So.
We still have plenty of time.
Oh, we do.
We still have a few
I'm
minutes.
not sure I want to get in trouble. But I will also mention to you that there are some other sources that we could look forward to, and we should encourage it. So I'll whip out my new IHMC pen. Zoom in, if you probably can't pin it. But this is from the IHMC.
If you hold it over that way, she might be able to get
And
it
so
to you that way.
they gave it to me today.
I'm not
So
sure
the
if you can or not.
IHMC, it turns out
You
Ken
want me to
Ford...
hold it for you? Let me
Yes.
see if I can hold it for
Ken
you.
Ford is involved with with
you'll be able to see it.
performance enhancement. That's one of his missions over at the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition. And one of the talks I heard him talk on is, different ways to increase our soldiers' fighting ability. And I've already mentioned before on this TV show ketogenic diets and things like that. But he's actually talking about using certain herbals, which are legal, and kratom is one of them. But these are mu receptor agonists. And the mu receptor agonist is something that we should actually look at some of the herbals that come out of the original China groups, find other ways to stimulate your mu receptor that'll take away your pain, not give you the euphoria, and don't give you all this withdrawal deal. We should have alkaloids that are coming from other natural plants, and we should not be mass producing some of these type things. And I'm very concerned because in the mass production, we finally have what goes around comes around. I'm going to mention fentanyl. Look up counterfeit fentanyl onto Google. The articles in the journal just knocked my sock off when I saw this, because China has come up with all their little sharp chemists. Fentanyl was a drug that was made by Janssen's Pharmaceuticals early on, very potent. It is so strong. And suddenly they're making fentanyl, they're cutting the opium with it, they're making fake pills, and they're selling it, and you think that you're getting OxyContin. And that is why we have such a high death rate right now. What's gone around comes around. The East India Company is biting you. Stop this drug problem. They should put naloxone in every single one of those oxycodones.
And I tell you, it's an interesting story. We thank you for joining us for this month's version of Health Talk. We hope to see you next month. Thanks so much. We'll be back with more Health Talk next month.